Okay, hello everyone. So today our group will present you our topic about grammar and style, sentence style, and grammar and gender. Our group consists of me, Alice, Ricky, and Che Claudia. Here are our table content, and let's get started. First, we are going to talk about grammar and style. When we talk about grammar of language, we are talking of hugely complex set of interlocking categories, units, and structure. Or we can say that the rules of that language itself. So in academic study of language, the expression of rules of grammar does not refer to prospective niceties or the sort of prescription that forbid the use of double negative or split infinitive. Well, so these so-called rules are nothing more than a random collection of prejudiced structure of language use. On the contrary, the genuine grammatical rules of language are the language itself. Insofar, they stipulate the very bedrock of its syntactic construction. This makes grammar somewhat of an intimidating area of analysis for the beginning of stylization, because it's not always easy to sort out which aspect of the text may interlocking pattern of grammar are stylistically salient. Therefore, we will use this unit to try to develop some use of building blocks for study of grammar and style. Now let's move to the basic model of grammar. So most of theories of grammar accept that grammatical units are ordered hierarchically according to their size. This hierarchy is known as a rank scale, and the arrangement is from the largest to the smallest. So here we start from sentence as the largest unit, down to the clause, down to the phrase, and then down to the word, and the last one down to the morpheme. So morpheme is the smallest unit of this scale because morpheme doesn't have a structure of its own. In this topic, we will mostly talk about clause because clause is the most important important unit of this scale, because here are the reasons. Clause provide tense, and it also distinguishes between positive and negative polarity. It also provides the core or the nub of proposition in language. And then it is where the information about grammatical mood, about whether a clause is declarative, interrogative, or imperative is situated. And therefore, the clause will be the principal focus of interest in the following discussion. And then here, for our purpose, we can distinguish four basic elements of clause structure. There are subject, predicator, complement, and adjunct. And here I provide you 5 examples that we will use for the further discussion. Indeed, it is defining characteristic of clause structure that is four basic elements are typically realized by a certain type of phrase. For instance, the predicator is always filled by the first phrase. And then for the noun, and then for the subject, for the subject is typically filled by the noun phrase. And then for the complement, they typically filled by a noun phrase too, but for example number 4 and number 5, they was filled by adjective phrase. And then for the adjunct, they typically filled by the adverb. phrase, for example number 1, but for example number 4 and 5, they was filled by prepositional phrase. So there are some cases. Next, we are going to move to test for clause constitute. So here we can test for the subject, complement, and adjunct element of clause structure by asking various questions around the verb, assuming, of course, that we can find the verb. So here are the list of useful tests for sorting out the clause structure. The first one is finding the subject. It should answer the question who or what placed in the front of the verb. And then finding the complement, it should answer the question who or what placed after the verb. And for the adjunct, it should answer the questions such as how, when, where, or why placed after the verb. So if we use the example of woman fits those pigeon regularly, we can ask the question like who or what fits those pigeon regularly. The answer will be the woman, right? So the woman is the subject of the clause. That's why we can confirm the woman as the subject element. That is the example. And then there are also another useful test for element of clause structure, which can also be used to adduce further information about grammatical structure. That is by adding a tag question to the declarative form of clause. So these are the example, like the woman fit those pigeons regularly, doesn't she? Our bull terrier was chasing the postman yesterday, was it? So the tag question or the tag test can usefully differentiate between other type of grammatical structure. Here for the variation in basic clause of structure, whereas most of the example provided so far exhibit a basic SPCA pattern of clause structure, it is important to note that this configuration represents only one of the number of possible combinations. Other types of grammatical mood, for example, involve different types of causal patterning. So a case point in the imperative, which is form typically used for request and command, for example, mind your hat, there is no subject element in this form. But for the interrogative form, they typically use for asking question, and this form do contain subject. For example, would Professor Necromancy wear lipstick every Friday? And yeah, that is for the variation in basic clause structure. For the declarative clause, the declarative clause may themselves display the significant variation around the basic SPCA pattern. Occasionally, a clause may contain two complements. This occurs when one of the C elements is a direct object and indirect object. For example, is Mary gave her friend a book. Notice that this example will satisfy our test for complement element, that in the test question, the sentence will answer each case, like Mary gave who and what. So the answer will be Mary gave her friend a book. Okay, and then the next one is for adjunct element. Adjunct elements are many and varied in terms of form they take and of the type of information they bring to a clause. They basically describe the circumstance that attach to the process related by the clause, and for that reason they can often be removed without affecting the grammaticality of the clause as a whole. So here are the example of a clause with an SPAAAA pattern. Mary awoke suddenly in her hotel room one morning because of a knock on the door. So if we remove one adjunct from this sentence, it won't affecting the grammatical form, and it's still like grammatically correct. And then for the term minor clause is conventionally used to describe structure. Is it important to acknowledge the minor clause is not only because this elliptical structure play an important role in much spoken interaction, but also because, as the other unit in this thread will argue, there is a form an important locus for stylistic experiment. And then finally, as general rule of thumb, when analyzing elements which are present in text, there are only be one subject element and one predicator element of structure in any given clause. But however, they may be up to two complement elements and any number of adjunct elements in any given clause. And that will close my explanation about grammar and style. Thank you for listening.
Sentence style, development, and illustration. Definition of sentence: a set of words that is complete in itself, typically containing a subject and predicate, conveying a statement, question, exclamation, or command, and consisting of a main clause and sometimes one or more subordinate clauses. There are four types of sentence. 1. Simple sentence, compound sentence, complex, and the last one is compound complex. Simple sentence. A simple sentence is a sentence containing only one clause or more specifically an independent clause with a subject and a predicate. For example, like Buddhi played basketball, it contains subject, verb, and object, or Buddhi played, which is just contains subject and verb. Both of these examples are grammatically correct simple sentences, but including an object helps to clarify the full idea of a sentence. Compound sentence. A compound sentence joins two or more independent clauses with a coordinator such as for, and, or but, or a semicolon. Independent clauses are two phrases that can stand alone as a complete thought, but they tie together similar idea. Examples: I have a snake and I have a dog. We could separate the compound sentence into two smaller complete thoughts. Sentence 1, I have a snake, and sentence 2, I have a dog. And the second example, we use a conjunction, which is we use or in the sentence. So we have two independent clauses. She is going to the movies or she is going to the park. She is going to the movies is an independent clause where she is the subject, is going is the action, and a complete thought is expressed. She is going to the park is independent clause where she is the subject, is going is the action, and a complete thought is expressed. A complex sentence. A complex sentence is a sentence that contains one independent and at least one dependent clause, or sometimes called a subordinate clause. Like what I already explained in a compound sentence, an independent clause is a phrase that would make sense if it were a sentence on its own, whereas a dependent clause will not form a sentence on its own. But when these two types of clauses appear in a sentence, we create a complex sentence. Examples: she liked to eat candy before she watched a movie. Here's the explanation. She liked to eat candy is an independent clause. It makes sense as a stand-alone sentence. Before she watched movie doesn't make sense on its own. The last one is compound complex. A compound complex sentence is one with at least two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. Compound complex sentences help us express longer, more complicated thought with more parts than other sentences. For example, Jake doesn't like horrors because they are loud, so he doesn't watch them. This sentence has two independent clauses and one dependent clause. The dependent clause, because they are loud, cannot stand on its own as a complete sentence. It is dependent. As you have probably figured out, the independent clauses, Jake doesn't like horrors and he doesn't watch them, can be complete sentences on their own.
Okay, in my part, we will discuss about grammar and genre. We will also discuss about imagism in a poetry. Grammar and genre, a short study in imagism. This unit experiments with grammatical patterns in poetry in order to help us think about the processes involved in translating experiences and thoughts into the type of text that is a poem. Once again, because this is a stylistic subject, so we study the style of the texts or literary works. And yes, this unit focuses only on the grammatical patterns in a poetry, so not the other literary works but poetry. Here we also have the term imagism. What is actually imagism? Imagism is aiming at clarity of expression through the use of precise visual image. We can say it more simply as creating images with words from literary works. The concept is actually easy. It's like imagining something when you read something. For example, you can see this word, a feather. A feather. After hearing that or reading that word, an image will appear in your mind, right? So you will imagining a feather. That is basically what is imagism. Let me use another example. When I say laptop, do you think of a laptop? Do you imagine a laptop in your mind? And yes, that is an imagism in poetry. So once again, we are only talking about poetry here. And those images in poetry can occur with a single word, a phrase, a sentence, or even the whole poetry itself. Thus, imagism is closely and very connected to grammatical patterns because we use words and grammar in order to make the imaginary thing in our mind. That's why we try to applicate the stylistic and grammatical pattern in a poem using imagism. Okay, the first point that I want to discuss, from experience to language. So basically, we make images through poetry using our experience and we write it with our language. Okay, firstly, you need to read, or maybe you can listen to me reading this part of a letter by a well-known American writer to his friend in 1911. For well over a year, I have been trying to make poem of a very beautiful thing that befell me in the Paris underground. I got out of a train at, I think, La Concorde, and in the jostle I saw a beautiful face, and then, turning suddenly, another and another, and then a beautiful child's face, and then another beautiful face. All that day I tried to find words for what this made me feel. That night, as I went home along the Rue Noire, I was still trying. I could get nothing but spots of color. I remember thinking that if I had been a painter, I might have started a wholly new school of painting. And that was the letter. You can actually feel the experience, right? That felt experience triggered the writer to make the poetry. And because this is very related to experience, let me ask you some questions. If you were asked specifically to produce a short poem of only a few lines, what kind of imaginative impulse would you use? What words would you use? Would you position yourself as the voice in the poem, like the writer uses I? Would you situate your poem in a specific time and place, like the writer does? What choice of words or vocabularies would you use to capture the impact of the experience? Would you address the reader as you, or you prefer to generalize it? And what sort of sound of rhythm structure would you use? Would you use a reverse? Notice how every choice the writer made is affecting the imagery to the poetry, or in this case, the letter. Those questions above are the questions that can be asked to review, analyze, or study the grammatical pattern in a poem. Alright, second point, probing grammatical patterns back to front. Okay, first I have a task for you to do. Can you make a short poetry with this scrambled grammatically in the form of noun phrases and prepositional phrases with no capital letters so that you don't know the order? So we will see that whether the grammatical pattern can make a poetry interesting or not. It's actually a real poetry, by the way, so if you do the jackpot, you can make the original poetry using these scrambled phrases. So, okay, grab your notes or phone or laptop and do this task for a minute. Arrange these scrambled phrases into a poetry or a poem. Okay, start. A minute. Okay, it's a minute. Alright, time's almost up. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and stop. Okay, that's a minute. Do you have any difficulties? What kind of grammatical steps are necessary for constructing the poetry anyway? Do you see some missing things here? No? Okay, we move on to the third point. The third point, grammar and literary genre. There are actually many ways of bolting together the phrases above to construct a poem, resulting in a number of possible permutations. So there are a lot of possibilities. You can literally put random phrases in random order to make a poetry. Yes, you did have some difficulties in choosing order, right? You did, because it lacks one crucial grammatical feature. And you didn't know that? And I will tell you right now. That is verb. Yeah, in those phrases there are no verbs at all. Okay, after you did your task, here is the answer. Well, it is not the answer, but the original poetry. It is based on the 17-syllable Japanese haiku poem. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd petals on a wet black bough. That was the original poetry. And yeah, as you can see, this original poetry has no verb at all. With that, many grammatical structures such as finiteness, tense and time reference, and prepositional value are gone. From that, other aspects of clause structure collapse, because a grammatical subject cannot be formed, nor can complement elements be positioned related to a verb. So, what remains in the light of these grammatical operations from the couplet is the sparse juxtaposition of a statement of experience and a statement of interpretation. Okay, the first line of the poetry being the experience that the writer imagining, basically the event happening in the poetry. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, that is the event. And the second line is the metaphorical meaning, something happening inside the mind. petals on a wet black bough. So it's like the metaphorical meaning. This brings result to the poetry become a frozen, crystallized moment, ignoring the time-space. So the story in the poetry is happening in an instant. The time is frozen there. The image is quite pretty good and complex, although the number of words and vocabularies are really so little. It doesn't even have a verb in it, but the feeling and the image are there. This makes the poetry more contemplative and meditative. It's more lyrical. So we can say that the study of a grammar is also very crucial in studying literary works, because we can also see the style of the writer writing his work through the grammar. And this is all this presentation about, the stylistic and grammar and genre. Okay, thank you guys for listening and watching this video. Hopefully you understand something about grammar in stylistic. And if you have a question, please ask us. See you later.